Chapter 23 of Poison Island. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Logan Lorenz. Poison Island by Sir Arthur Thomas Quiller-Couch. Chapter 23. How we sailed to the island. The business of the sail concluded, we had nothing to detain us, and an order was at once sent to Captain Branscombe to book our passages in the next packet for the West Indies. Meanwhile, we held long discussions on details of outfit, for since our impedimenta included two moderately heavy chests, the one of guns and ammunition, the other of spades, picks, hatchets, and other tools, and since on reaching Jamaica we must take a considerable journey on muleback, it was important to cut our personal luggage down to the barest necessities. We did not forget a medicine chest. On August 28th, we received word from Captain Branscombe that he had taken berths for us on the Townshend packet commanded by an old friend of his, a Captain Harrison. She was due to set sail on the 1st. Accordingly, on August 30th, we travelled down by Royal Mail to Falmouth. Mr. Rogers, following that same noon by the High Flyer, spent a busy day in making some last purchases, and a sleepless night in the noisiest of hotels, and went on board soon after breakfast, to be welcomed there by Mr. Goodfellow, who had got over his parting 3 days before at Plymouth, and professed himself to be in the very jolliest of spirits. At the head of the after companion, Captain Branscombe met us and conducted us below, to introduce us to our quarters and be complimented on the thought and care he had bestowed in choosing them and fitting them up, for the ladies' comfort especially. He himself lodged forward, in a small double cabin which he shared with Mr. Goodfellow. I will spare the reader a description of our departure and of the passage to Jamaica, not only because they were quite uneventful, we did not even sight a privateer, but because they have been celebrated in verse by Pliny, in a descriptive poem of 5 cantos and some 4,000 lines, entitled The Voyage, with an Englishwoman's reflections on her favourite element, a few extracts from which I am permitted to quote. We sailed for Kingston in the Townshend packet. The day auspicious was, and calm the heavens. Not so the scene on board. Oh, what a racket! And everything on deck apparently at 6s and 7s. Mail bags and passengers mixed up in every direction, the latter engaged with their relatives in fond farewells, on the one hand the faltering accents of affection, on the other the unpolished seamen emitting yells, with criticisms of the custom house official, whose action for some reason they resented as prejudicial. At length the last farewell is said, the anchor tripped, the gangway cleared, 'twas 5 p.m. ere past Pendennis Head. Forth to the unfathomable deep we steered. The boatswain piped. He wore a manly beard. And while the attentive crew the braces trimmed, alluding to the ships, and while from observation the coast receded, we, with eyes bedimmed, indulged in feelings natural to the situation. Albion, my Albion, so called from the hue, thy cliffs wear by the straits of Dover, though darker in this neighbourhood, still, adieu. Albion, adieu. I feel myself a rover. Thy sons instinctively take to the water, and so will I, albeit but a daughter. A page later, in more tripping metre, which reflects her gaiety of spirits, she describes the ship. The Townshend packet is a gallant brig of 180 tons. 'Tis the Postmaster General's favourite rig, and she carries 6 useful guns. As she sails, with His Majesty's mails, hurrah for her long 6-pounders! They relieve our fear of a privateer. But what shall we do if she founders? I prefer not to think of any such contingency. She has excellent sailing qualities, and her captain appears to rule with stringency, and to be averse from minor frivolities. With the late Admiral Nelson he may not provoke comparison, but one and all place implicit confidence in Captain Harrison. While Pliny cultivated the muse, and with the more zest as to her pride and delight she found herself immune from seasickness, I kept up, through the long mornings, the pretense of studying mathematics with Captain Branscombe, and regularly at noon received a lesson in taking the ship's bearings. Our fellow voyagers were mostly merchants and agents bound for Jamaica, the trade of which had revived since the restoration of peace, and among them we passed for a well-to-do family, traveling partly for pleasure to visit the island, but partly also with an idea of buying a plantation and settling there, which explained the presence of Mr. Goodfellow. Our captain justified the confidence so poetically expressed above. He sailed his ship along steadily, taking no risks, and after a pleasant passage of 36 days, brought her to anchor in Carlisle Bay, Barbados, where we were due to deliver some bags of mails. I have said that the trip was uneventful. It was even without incident save for some fooleries on reaching the line, and such trifling distractions as an unsuccessful attempt to shoot an albatross, and the sighting of some flying fish and sundry long-tailed birds which the sailors called boatswains. But, as Pliny wrote, "Life at sea has a natural monotony, of which 'twere irrational to complain. You cannot, for instance, study botany, as in an English country lane. But the mind is superior to distance, with its own reminiscences stored, not to mention the spiritual assistance we derived from a clergyman on board." He was a sallow young man of delicate constitution, and, partly for his health's sake, had accepted the pastorate of a Genevan church in Kingston. From Barbados, we beat up for Jamaica, and anchored in Kingston Harbor just 45 days from home. The next morning, we said farewell to the ship, and were rowed ashore to a good hotel where we spent a lazy week in email excursions, while Captain Branscombe busied himself in hiring a mule train and holding consultations with a firm of merchants, Messrs. Cox and Roebuck, to whom Miss Belcher came recommended with a letter of credit. These gentlemen, understanding that we desired to cross over to the Main to visit some relations of Miss Belcher, resident in Virginia, for that was our pretense, opined that the matter was not difficult of management, but that we must needs travel to the extreme west of the island if we would hire a vessel for the purpose, and they mentioned an agent of theirs at Savannah-la-Mar, Jacob Paz by name, as the likeliest man for our purpose. Armed with a letter of introduction to this man, in the early morning of October 22nd, we started on muleback, and traveling without haste through the exquisite scenery of Jamaica, the main roads of which put ours of Cornwall to shame, arrived at Savannah-la-Mar on the 27th, a great part of the way having been occupied by Miss Belcher, who hated the sight of a Negro, in rebuking Pliny's sentimental objections to slavery, and by Mr. Rogers in begging a collection of hummingbirds. It took, I believe, some time at Savannah-la-Mar to convince Mr. Paz, a subtle half-breed, that we were actually fools enough to wish to purchase one of his vessels, and mad enough to propose working her alone. He had 3 boats idle, including a pretty little fore and aft schooner of 30 tons, the Espriella, which Captain Branscombe had no sooner set eyes upon than he decided to be the very thing for our purpose. She was fitted with a large ladies' cabin aft of the companion, a saloon, and a small single-berth cabin between it and the forecastle, which would house 3 men comfortably. We ended by purchasing her for £370, and into the forecastle I went with Mr. Goodfellow and Mr. Jack Rogers, who insisted on resigning the spare cabin to Captain Branscombe, henceforward, or until we should reach the island, by consent the leader of the expedition. So, on October 30th, at 6 in the morning, after being commended to God by Mr. Paz, we worked out of Savannah-la-Mar, and having gained an offing with a light breeze, hoisted all our bits of canvas, even to a light jib topsail we found on board, chiefly I think to impress her late owner, whom we could descry on the shore, watching us. He had steadfastly refused to believe us capable of handling a boat, whereas of our party, Pliny and Mr. Goodfellow were the only landlubbers. Miss Belcher could take the helm with the best of us, and indeed it was reported of her that she had on more than one occasion played helmswoman to a run of goods upon her own Cornish estate. Mr. Jack Rogers had once owned a yacht and suffered from tedium. Now, as a foremast hand, he was enjoying himself amazingly. But the pride above all prides was Captain Branscombe's. After many years he trod a deck again, commander of his own ship, and the bearing of the man was that of a prince restored after long exile to his kingdom. Courteous as ever to the ladies, to the rest of us he behaved as a master, noble but severe, unwearied in explaining the least minutiae of seamanship, inexorable in seeing that his smallest instruction was obeyed. Mr. Rogers at the end of the first day confided to me that he had much ado to refrain from touching his forelock whenever he heard the skipper's voice. I shall not be believed if I say that in all the 5 days of our voyage Captain Branscombe never snatched a wink of sleep. Doubtless he did sleep between whiles, but doubtless also no one saw him do it. It was daybreak or thereabouts on the morning of November 5th, and a faint light coming through the deck light over the forecastle, when I, that had kept the middle watch and was now snoring in my bunk, sat up at a touch on my shoulder and stared, rubbing my eyes, into the dim face of Mr. Goodfellow. "Skipper wants you on deck," he announced. "We've lifted something on the starboard bow, and he swears 'tis the island." End of chapter 23.